December 6, 1941. On a frozen deck in Hitokapu Bay, a Japanese pilot holds a farewell letter to his chest and wonders if the enemy he will strike is as weak as he has been told. Here is the hook. Within 24 hours, he will learn that the most dangerous weapon in this war is not a torpedo or a bomb, but a factory that never sleeps. Lieutenant Zenji Abe stands on the carrier Akagi, his breath turning white in the Arctic air. In his pocket is a lock of hair for a funeral. That may happen without a body. He is ready to die with honor, but he is not ready for doubt. He asks himself a quiet question that no one dares to speak aloud. Are the Americans truly in decline, or are we walking towards something we do not understand? This question is born from policy, not only from courage. In July 1941, the United States freezes Japan's assets and cuts off oil. Britain and the Dutch East Indies follow. In a single move, the empire loses 80% of its fuel. The Navy can sail, but the clock is running. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knows America. He studied at Harvard, walked its streets, and saw its factories. He warns that true victory would require dictating peace in Washington. He knows that is impossible. Yet he designs the only plan he believes can buy time. Strike Pearl Harbor, seize oil, and force negotiations before American industry wakes, so the First Air Fleet slips into the storm tracks of the North Pacific. 6 carriers. Absolute silence. Months of training over Kagoshima Bay to skim torpedoes through shallow water. Pilots write final letters. One by one, they fold their fears into discipline. This is not the story of victors. This is the story of men who will win a morning and lose a future. What they destroy at Pearl Harbor will be counted in ships and lives. What they fail to destroy will be counted in months, in steel, and in a rising noise that drowns hope. Stay, because the answer to Abe's question will not come from the sky over Oahu. It will come from the assembly line, and it will decide everything. Listen closely, because the most dangerous element in this story is not a weapon, it is a belief. The belief that the enemy is weak. The belief that will walk men into a war they cannot win. On the night of December 6, 1941, a Japanese pilot on a frozen carrier deck holds a farewell letter to his chest and convinces himself his doubt is disloyal. He is wrong. His doubt is the only honest thing in the wind. Lieutenant Zenji Abe stands on Akagi in the Arctic breath of Hitokapu Bay. His leather jacket is stiff with cold. In his pocket is a lock of his hair, a last gift for a funeral that may have no body to mourn. He has written to his wife that morning with calm words and a single promise. If I do not return, know that I served with honor. He speaks duty like a prayer, but he cannot silence the thought that keeps returning, with every breath. Are the Americans as weak as we have been told, or are we running towards something we do not understand? This doubt is not treason. It is the shadow of policy. In July 1941, the United States freezes Japan's assets and imposes a total oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch East Indies follow at once. A single decision cuts off 4 out of every 5 drops of Japanese fuel. The empire that modernized in a generation now feels an old truth press on its throat, i.e., Navy does not run on courage, it runs on oil. The numbers are hard and cold. 18 months of reserves in peace, less than a year if war begins. Every engine start is now an hour lost. Inside that pressure, Japan argues with itself. Some officers speak of destiny and duty. Others speak of geography and iron ore and shipping. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto does not speak of destiny. He speaks of the United States in a way that makes young officers uneasy. He studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He lived in Washington as a naval attaché. He gambled in American clubs, saw American cars, walked past American factories. He knows what a continent can do when it is awake. He writes a warning that sounds like an accusation. Should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines or even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. He sends this thought upstream and knows as he seals the envelope that it will not be accepted. He is a patriot. When the die is cast, he will not argue again. He will design the only plan he thinks can buy time. This plan is not bravado. It is a tourniquet. Strike Pearl Harbor with overwhelming force. Break the American fleet's spine in a morning. Use the shock to seize oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and everything that can keep an island empire alive. Hold a ring of fortified outposts across the Pacific. Offer peace terms before the American factories find their rhythm. 6 months, a year at most. It is a gambler's plan because the clock holds the gun, and the man holding it knows the house he is playing against. The pilots train until their bodies remember what fear makes the mind forget. Kagoshima Bay is chosen because it looks like the target. Mountains falling into a shallow harbor. Torpedo crews practice releases at 10 to 20 meters above the water, a height that feels like touching death with the belly of the plane. Torpedoes are adjusted to run at 10 meters depth, so they will not plow into the harbor bottom and die. Dive bombers practice steep descents until their vision pulses at the edge. Every movement is drilled into muscle and habit. The plan at this level is elegant. Precision is a kind of mercy. Precision means fewer passes, fewer minutes under fire, fewer names read later to families. There are private stories inside this public machine. Kaname Harada, a pilot from Soryu, sends his pregnant wife back to Nagano in September when training intensifies. They say goodbye without tears, because tears are a kind of guilt. Her letters reach him daily until the ship departs. Then there is silence, thick as the winter sky. Men hide photographs in pockets as if paper can protect flesh. Many cut locks of hair for the rituals of a death they may not see. They tell each other they are ready. They say it so often that it almost sounds true. The political decision becomes a moral frame around these lives. It is easy to call this courage. It is harder to call it what it also is, a bet placed against arithmetic. Japan has built a navy of great skill. Its aviators are the best trained on Earth. Its carriers are well handled. But the emperor's government has placed that skill inside a shrinking circle of fuel and iron. This is the loser's perspective, and it is not self-pity. It is a hard mirror held up to power. When a nation chooses war because it cannot afford peace, every victory comes with a debt it cannot repay. Young officers repeat slogans to steady their hands. Older men think about numbers they cannot say aloud. If we win the first 6 months, will they talk? Can we make them believe the Pacific is too wide and the price too high? Or will they do what Yamamoto has already seen them do? Organize, build, and come back in numbers that turn skill into a footnote. This is the mental conflict that never makes it into official orders, the pulse of pride against the steady beat of production. On the last night before the attack, Abe walks the deck and listens to the sounds a ship makes when no one is talking. There is a tension in silence that words cannot hold. He thinks of his wife. He thinks of the letter in his pocket. He thinks of a simple image that will return to him years later in dreams. A line of smokestacks against a winter sky, long and endless, as if the horizon were a factory. He does not know why this picture comes. He does not know that this is the true enemy his nation has chosen. We remember Pearl Harbor as fire and explosion, but for the men who flew toward it, the first sensation was cold. Cold air slicing the lungs, cold logic inside warm uniforms, cold timelines on a calendar that counts oil in months and lives in weeks. The story that begins on this deck is not a romantic one. It is not a saga of rising suns. It is a study in how a plan can be brilliant and still be fatal, because it ignores the scale of the world it moves inside. In Tokyo in November, the discussions were plain but tense. There were voices that argued for caution. There were voices that feared the Soviet Union more than the United States. There were voices that believed America was decadent. There were voices that did not believe at all. The embargo turned those debates into a funnel. Each week without oil narrowed the choices. Eventually, there was only one decision that felt like action, and because it felt like action, it felt like life. Not acting felt like slow strangulation. Men will choose risk over suffocation, even if the risk is death. It is not because they are fearless, it is because they need to move. Yamamoto's orders are clear, and within their clarity you can hear the confession he cannot write. Strike fast, strike hard, withdraw before the American carriers can find you. Accept that you are buying time, not victory. He knows Pearl Harbor is a move on a larger board. He hopes the opponent, shocked, will fold. He knows if they do not, nothing in the arsenal of courage can replace a missing oil tanker or forge a ship overnight. He knows because he has seen the place where ships are born. The men under him do not speak this way. They speak about precision, timing, and weather. They check instruments and maps. They rehearse hand signals and radio silence. They sleep in short bursts and dream about reaching the target at dawn. They imagine the shape of the harbor from training, its geography folded into their bodies. They think of the sound a torpedo makes when it hits, a wooden thud through water. They trust the plan because they must. Faith is not only religious, it is also procedural. But even inside faith there are questions that do not sleep. What if the carriers are not there? What if the American planes are not on the ground? What if we strike and still lose the one thing we need most, time to negotiate before their factories wake? This last fear is so abstract it feels like a superstition. Factories wake. Machines do not sleep, do they? But whole nations do. And when they rise, they carry tools. On Akagi, there is a detail that will make sense only later. The ice on the railing leaves a hard line on Abe's glove. He rubs it, and the skin beneath tingles with heat that has no comfort. He closes his eyes and tries to see 6 months into the future. He sees islands he has never stood upon, lines on maps that curve across vast blue pages, numbers that grow larger than memory can hold. He opens his eyes, and there is only steel and breath, and the scrape of a deck shoe on metal. We can judge a plan by its elegance or by its results. Those who lose learn to judge it by its assumptions. Pearl Harbor was built on an assumption about time. That time would be on Japan's side for a window big enough to push through, that America would hesitate, that political cost would outweigh national pride, that the Pacific would be a moat rather than a highway. These assumptions make sense when you are small and quick. They do not survive when you force your opponent to think in years rather than days. As midnight approaches, the ship hums with a new energy, the alertness of men who are done waiting. Abe goes below and stows the letter where he hopes it will be found. He checks a map he already knows by heart. He breathes and counts his breaths, then stops because it is making him dizzy. He remembers a lesson from flight school. When you go into a dive, the horizon can lie to you. Your body will tell you things that are not true. Trust the instruments. Tonight his instruments are numbers and they are not friendly. There is one more thought that enters and will not leave. If we succeed, what have we woken? If we fail, what have we thrown away? These are not grand questions. They are small and real. He thinks of his wife, of his parents, of a street in his hometown where he first saw an airplane and felt his chest fill with a new kind of air. He thinks of the men around him, some trying to sleep, some writing, some staring at nothing as if nothing itself held an answer. He thinks for a moment that war is not a contest between brave men. It is a race between systems. Then he pushes the thought down, because it is too heavy to carry into the morning. At dawn, alarms will sound and engines will rise to a pitch that erases thought. But here, in the last hours of dark, the mind still speaks. It tells him a simple truth that is hard to admit. Not all courage is equal. Some courage breaks a line of defense. Some courage faces mathematics. The first kind looks glorious. The second kind looks like doubt. He turns his face to the wind and lets it sting him awake. Somewhere beyond the black edge of the sea lies Oahu. Somewhere beyond that lies a nation he has never truly seen, except in the careful words of one admiral who played cards with it and watched how it stacked its deck, openly, relentlessly, without drama, until the table itself seemed to bend with, wait. Abe does not know any of this with certainty. He only knows that tomorrow he must fly. And so a story begins on a frozen deck with a question pressed against a beating heart. It is not the question of how to hit a ship or how to aim a bomb. It is the question that will decide the fate of an empire. What do you awaken when you strike a sleeping giant? The answer will not come in the fire of the first morning. It will come later in the rhythm of machines. But before we reach that noise, the fleet must enter silence. 6 carriers will turn their bows toward the storm and the Pacific will swallow their wake. In the next hour, surprise will seem like victory. In the next part, you will hear how that surprise was built, how men trained their bodies to fly inches above death, and how a single flare rose into the sky to announce a triumph that already contained its end. Imagine turning off every device, every voice, every signal, and moving through storm and darkness for days, with only your thoughts to keep you company. That is what 6 Japanese carriers did in late November 1941. They slipped into the North Pacific where winter hits like a hammer, and they vanished. No radios, no lights, no second chances. If you have ever gone silent before a hard decision, an exam, a job interview, a medical test, you know that strange mix of focus and fear. Now stretch that feeling across 3,500 miles of black water, because that is what the First Air Fleet carried toward Oahu. On November 26, 1941, the fleet left Hitokapu Bay, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. With them sailed 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 7 tankers, and 3 submarines. On their decks waited 414 aircraft and the finest naval aviators in the world. The route north was chosen because almost no one sailed there in winter. The seas were a shield of ice and wind, and American eyes did not look that way. Radio silence was absolute. Not a single careless word crossed the air. If you have ever typed a message and stopped before hitting send, you understand the discipline. Now imagine that discipline enforced for the life of an entire fleet. The pilots had trained until their fear had no room left to grow. Kagoshima Bay, with its mountains falling into a shallow harbor, stood in for Pearl Harbor. Torpedo bombers drilled again and again to fly barely above the water, releasing their weapons at 10 to 20 meters, a height where a mistake is death. The torpedoes were modified to run at only 10 meters depth, so they would not slam into the harbor bottom. Dive bombers practiced steep descents until gravity itself felt like an enemy they had learned to tame. Think about parallel parking with a cliff on either side of your car. Think about holding your breath and threading a needle in a moving train. That is how precise these men became. Kaname Harada, from the carrier Soryu, sent his pregnant wife back to her family in Nagano when the training grew intense. They said goodbye without tears. In his culture, those tears belong to the living after the fact, not to the men leaving. She wrote him daily until the fleet sailed. Then overnight her letters stopped. Silence does something to a person. If you have waited for a call that did not come, you know that silence is not empty. It is loud. It turns your heartbeat into a clock. Life on the carriers settled into a ritual that was both simple and heavy. Crewmen checked lines and planes. Mechanics listened to engines like doctors listening to lungs. Pilots tried to sleep and could not. They went over maps they already knew, measured angles they had already measured, tied the same knot twice, then a third time. Small tasks became anchors. If you have ever cleaned your kitchen before a hard conversation, you understand this. Control what you can because much will soon be out of your hands. The sea punished them without mercy. Waves smashed bow on. The ships rolled and shuddered. Planes were lashed and relashed on deck as spray froze into knives on the railings. Men learned to walk with knees and hands as much as with feet. The cold was not just weather, it was a message. You are alone out here. And still they moved forward. The plan required this silence, this hardship, this narrowness. Precision is not comfortable, it is exact. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida walked the flight deck of Akagi like a man measuring time. He knew the first wave would be his to lead. 183 aircraft would lift into the morning and follow him south to Oahu. He carried a signal that all his pilots understood, a single dark blue flare for the attack to proceed. And he carried 3 words that would say what they all needed to hear. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Complete. Surprise achieved. If you have ever stood outside a closed door before you knocked, you know that small second where everything is decided by a single choice. He would have that second from the sky. Every man on those decks carried a private calculation he could not share. If we succeed, will it be enough? If we fail, can we still return? If the American carriers are at sea, what does that mean? The plan assumed they would hit battleships in port, destroy aircraft on the ground, and leave the harbor bleeding. But absence can be as dangerous as presence. An empty chair in a meeting can matter more than the people who sit there. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were not at Pearl Harbor. Their positions were unknown. The most powerful ships are not always the ones you see. On the last night before the launch, the fleet reached 230 miles north of Oahu. At 0600 on December 7th, engines coughed into life. Planes were rolled into position. The pilots checked each other's straps and looked each other in the eyes in a way that says more than words. You learn a lot about someone in a moment like that. You see the boy and the man at once. You see the training and the fear, the habit, and the hope. If you have ever held a friend's shoulder before they walked into something hard, you know this feeling. There is a curious pride mixed with dread in the loser's perspective. It is a pride in craft and in comrades, and a dread of the ledger that you cannot see but can feel. These men were the tip of a spear attached to a country that had been wounded by an embargo of oil. They felt both sharp and thin. They were ready to hit, but they knew that after they struck, the enemy would answer with something not in the manual: production. To them, this word did not yet have the weight it would soon carry. It felt like an idea, not a force. They would learn that a factory can be a weapon that does not sleep. Fuchida climbed into his Nakajima B-5N2. The deck crew waved him forward. The first planes raced down the deck and rose into darkness, then into a thin stripe of blue where the sun was beginning to press on the horizon. They flew south in tight order, every radio off, every thought loud. A pilot remembers small things in big moments: the itch beneath a glove, the shape of a cloud that looks like a mountain, the way your teeth feel when you clench them for too long. You build a trail of details to cross the moment. If you have ever prepared for something with months of focus, learning a language, training for a race, studying for a license, you know that the day itself feels unreal. The practice was a life. The event is a tunnel. The men of the first wave entered that tunnel at dawn. Below them the ocean was glass and slate. Ahead of them was an island they had studied in photographs and in the contours of Kagoshima. It is a strange feeling to know a place you have never seen, the way you know the layout of your own house in the dark. That was the point of their training: make Pearl Harbor into a muscle memory. At 0740, Fuchida's formation saw what they had come to find. The harbor spread below them, lined with warships, battleship row full, dry docks, cranes and runways laid out like a map finally made real. Surprise held. The American carriers were not there. The decision had to be made in seconds, and Fuchida made it. He pulled back his canopy, fired the flare and sent the message: Tora, Tora, Tora. In that moment, you can feel the human and the machine become one thing. This is what decades of doctrine and months of drilling do. They bring a choice to a point that cannot be delayed. But even as the flare arced, a thought cut through. Where are the carriers? Triumph and question, mixed in a way that is hard to describe unless you have lived it. It is like walking into a room you have dreamed about and finding one important chair empty. You are thrilled to be there. You are also aware that the person you needed to see is somewhere else, moving in a way you cannot predict. That is not a comfort. It is an omen. For the losers of history, omens are not poetry. They are early warnings. Think about your own life for a moment. When have you executed a plan perfectly and still felt a cold thread of doubt? Maybe you delivered a pitch, or brought your best to an exam, or guided your family through a tough week, and something still felt off, something you could not control, like a missing piece that made the whole puzzle feel unstable. That is the feeling that hung beneath the cockpits as the first wave slid into attack. The plan was flawless. The moment was theirs. But the absence of 3 ships was a shape cut out of the sky. The journey to this point had been built on silence and speed. It had been built on a nation's decision to act before it ran out of oil. It had been built on the hands of men who learned to fly inches above death and call it routine. And yet, in the final second, the biggest variable was not weather or courage. It was the unknown location of the carriers. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you face is not the enemy you see. It is the enemy you cannot find. Before we move to the attack itself, I want to ask you for something, because your attention gives this series its power. If you want to follow this story from the cockpit, from the deck, and from the cold logic that defines the loser's perspective, click the red button in the corner and subscribe now. Do it so you do not miss the next part, where one morning's victory turns into a seed of defeat. Do it to join a community that looks at war not as a parade, but as a set of human choices and consequences. One click keeps you from losing this thread to the noise of your day. If this has held you so far, keep it. Subscribe now and stay with us to the end. Fuchida's words crackled into the headsets. Pilots adjusted grips and sights. The quiet of the approach ended. Engines roared. Altimeters dropped. Torpedoes slid into water and found their lines like trained animals. Dive bombers tipped their noses to the sun and folded into gravity. The training at Kagoshima paid out in seconds, like a savings account emptied in a single urgent purchase. Every drill, every repetition, every silent night on winter seas converged here. In the loser's story, there is always a moment when winning feels like falling. It is not because the shot was wrong. It is because the target is not the hole. The hole is larger than the harbor, larger than the island, larger than the morning. The men in those planes did not know it yet, but the victory they were about to claim would open a door to a place they could not fight. The factory floor, the dry dock, the repair yard, the oil tank on the hill. They would hit hard and the world would gasp, and still something crucial would remain standing. That is where we go next. Into the fire and smoke, into the numbers that look like success, and into the details that do not burn. Stay with this at the moment, when precision meets consequence. The flare has already left its trail. The words have already been spoken. The harbor is waking up. The question is no longer whether the attack will work. It will. The question is what it will leave behind, and what that absence will mean for men who must soon learn that some victories are the first page of defeat. The first seconds felt like a held breath finally released. Torpedoes slid into the harbor at the practiced angle, caught the water and ran true. Battleships that had seemed eternal were suddenly mortal. Plumes rose, steel bent. Sound turned physical and hit the cockpit glass like a hand. On the decks below, men pointed and ran. In the sky, the pilots steadied their hands and did what they were trained to do: keep the nose level, find the line, release, and climb. Precision left no space for fear, not yet. Lieutenant Zenji Abe came in with the second wave, and the harbor looked like a painting set on fire. The USS Arizona was a wound that would never close, her forward magazines blown, a single blast taking 1,177 lives in an instant. Abe aimed for ships still able to fight. His dive was a straight fall of will, and the bomb release felt like a decision torn out of his chest. He pulled up into a sky now alive with tracers, the air itself stitching with anger. Discipline held, training held. The plan was moving, minute by minute, toward its end. The numbers of the morning took shape with terrible speed. 403 Americans killed, 1,170 wounded. Arizona and Oklahoma transformed from ships into tombs. 4 more battleships, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, broken but not destroyed. 188 aircraft smashed on the ground. On the Japanese side, 29 aircraft lost. 5 midget submarines gone. 64 men who would not return. On paper, it was a masterstroke. In the cockpit, it felt like the world had tilted, and then found a new center that was not yet fixed. Then came the detail that would not burn. The oil tanks on the shore stood whole, giant black lungs full of fuel. The submarine base was untouched. The repair shops and dry docks remained quiet and ready. The cranes still reached into the sky like iron trees. The pilots could see these facts even as they banked away. They could see what had not been hit. It is strange to feel a victory draw a circle around your own mistake in real time. But what if the most important targets were the ones that did not burn? On Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida argued for a third strike. Hit the fuel, hit the repair yards, break the base itself so it cannot be the heart of recovery. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo refused. Surprise was gone. American defenses were awake. The carriers were unaccounted for and dangerous. The fleet was far from home, far from support, and the pilots still had to land back on moving decks in winter seas. A third wave might wreck the base, or it might wreck the first air fleet. In that calculus, he chose caution. The men who had executed the perfect plan felt the edge of that choice. Triumph sagged into a silence full of what-ifs. They had done their part. They had hit the targets assigned. And yet a new fear crept in. Had the team that launched the blow also planted the conditions that would undo it? Yamamoto's warning about needing to dictate peace in Washington for true victory was not a prophecy. It was a map of limits. You can win a morning and still lose the year. The clearest sign of those limits was not in the water. It was in what stood behind it. Leaving the tanks, the dry docks and the shops intact meant Pearl Harbor could continue to function. Ships could be raised, aircraft could be replaced, the base could heal and then serve as the forward anchor for the Pacific Fleet. It would not be a graveyard. It would be a forge. The decision that seemed tactically wise became strategically heavy in ways that could not yet be seen, but would not be avoided. As the second wave turned for home, many pilots looked down through smoke and tried to measure size with their eyes. The number of piers, the spread of warehouses, the width of the yards. It felt like trying to judge the weight of a city from a photograph. They carried those images back to their carriers like stones in a pocket. Some told themselves they were imagining things. Some stared at the deck and said nothing. Some began to understand that the enemy's strength was not only afloat, it was assembled, stored, and waiting in shapes that did not move. Had they won a victory, or had they purchased a deadline? Abe recorded later that the missing carriers haunted the edges of his memory more than any explosion. An empty space can be more frightening than a full one. Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, out there, somewhere like knives in the dark. He could not stop thinking of them, because absence is a kind of presence in war. You feel the shape of what is missing, and your body prepares for a blow you cannot see. The morning lasted 1 hour and 15 minutes. 2 waves came and went. Between them, anti-aircraft fire grew sharper, and the second wave flew into a sky that bit back. The discipline that made the attack possible also kept the retreat orderly. Pilots counted fuel. Leaders counted planes. The fleet turned north the way it had come, into cold and quiet. On the carriers, there was no cheering. There was work. There was the fragile stillness that comes after extreme focus, when the nerves try to find a safe place and cannot. On the shore, the untouched infrastructure waited. It would soon become the difference between a base that dies and a base that fights on. This is a lesson that belongs to the loser's perspective, because losers are forced to see the scaffolding of power. When your hit fails to break the frame, you begin to respect the frame more than the surface you damaged. Oil tanks are not dramatic in a photograph. Repair shops do not make headlines. But war does not care what looks heroic. It cares what works tomorrow. If the base survives, what multiplies inside those untouched walls? Nagumo's decision was not cowardice. It was logic under uncertainty. He did not know where the American carriers were. He did not know how much fuel his pilots would burn in a third strike and a long return through bad weather. He did not know if the element of surprise could be traded for a decisive blow without paying with ships he could not replace. He chose to preserve strength. He chose to leave. In another war, in another century, this might have been wise. Fuchida's pleas were born from what he saw from the sky. The tanks like open throats, the dry docks like open hands. He understood that the base itself was a weapon. He wanted to take away the thing that made recovery easy. He was outranked. He saluted and stood down. Later in memory, he would hold that moment like a shard of glass. It cut in both directions. If they had turned back and been ambushed by American carriers, the story would be a different tragedy. The men at the center never get to choose with perfect knowledge. By nightfall, counts were compiled. The attack was successful. The language of reports is always blunt where memory is sharp. 403 dead, 1,170 wounded. Arizona and Oklahoma forever gone. 4 battleships broken but alive. 188 aircraft destroyed. 29 Japanese aircraft lost. 5 midget submarines destroyed. 64 Japanese dead. These lines fit on paper. They do not fit in the mind of a man who saw oil burn on water and thought for a second that the bay itself was on fire. On the way back through the winter sea, some pilots slept like stones. Others stared at the ceiling and saw the outline of the harbor every time they blinked. They spoke in low voices about what they had done, and more quietly, about what they had not done. No one could know yet that Pearl Harbor would remain the forward base for the Pacific Fleet. No one could know yet that the ships would be raised and the runways cleared with a speed that would shock them. But something in the size of the place had already told the truth to their bodies. What do you do when your success plants the seed of your defeat? There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes to those who lose, the knowledge of scale. You begin to see that the battle is not only the noise and the flame, it is the ease with which your enemy absorbs damage and continues. The pilots had aimed well. They had fought well. They had taken their losses and kept their formation. But they had also left the enemy's lungs, hands, and heart unbroken. There is no comfort in saying we did our job when the job was not enough. From this point forward, the story changes shape. Instead of a duel of ships, it becomes a duel of capacity. The morning at Pearl Harbor proves that tactical skill can open a door. What steps through that door depends on what stands behind it. In the weeks and months that follow, the shape behind the door will reveal itself as something that does not tire, does not forget, and does not stop at night. It is not personal. It is a process. On December 7th, the flare rose and the message went out. Tora, Tora, Tora. Surprise achieved. What no signal could carry was the silent clause in that triumph. The base lived. The oil remained. The cranes would lift again. The docks would drain and fill. The submarines would patrol. The repair shops would hum. The Japanese fleet turned away from Oahu with the pride of a job done and the weight of a question they could not answer yet. The morning was theirs. The future was not. Here is where the loser's perspective becomes a guide and not only a wound. It teaches that a plan can be brilliant and still miss the point. It teaches that the enemy you need to defeat may not be the one you train to hit. It teaches that the most important choice of a day can be the target you do not select. These lessons are not bitter for drama. They are bitter because they are true, and because the men who felt them did not have the power to change them once the planes were in the air. The attack ended. The smoke began to thin. The fleets moved apart, and the clock, which had been ticking since the oil embargo, started to speak louder. Japan had perhaps 6 months to seize what it needed and force a settlement. That was the bet at the heart of the plan. Pearl Harbor had bought time, but had it bought enough? Or had the morning's fire only woken something that would keep building long after the flames were out? What happens when the enemy you wounded begins to count faster than you can kill? After the smoke of Pearl Harbor thinned, the war changed shape. It stopped sounding like explosions and started sounding like counting. A ledger opened. On one side stood skill and daring. On the other side stood time, fuel, steel, and hands that did not tire. From the loser's perspective, the silence after the first victory was the start of something colder. Arithmetic. The first tallies were already unsettling. In 1941, before the giant had fully woken, Japan produced 5,088 aircraft. The United States produced 19,133, nearly 4 to 1. This was not a rumor, it was a baseline. It meant that even if every Japanese pilot flew like a master, the sky would thicken against him month by month. It meant that for every loss Japan felt, America could answer with 4. Imagine playing a game where every move you make, your opponent makes 4. How long do you stay on the board? In June 1942, Midway cut the heart out of Japan's carrier force. 4 carriers lost in a few hours: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. They were not only ships, they were schools, doctrines, and the living memory of elite pilots. Japan entered the war with 10 carriers and would never again operate more than 6 at once. At the same time, the United States commissioned USS Essex, the first of a new class that would grow to 24. One battle flipped the graph lines. One ship's name became a headline for a series. Japan replaced hard-won experience with rookies. America replaced losses with more decks. The numbers tightened again in 1943. American factories began to move like weather, constant, large and indifferent to events. 8,000 to 9,000 aircraft per month left the lines. Japan's total for the entire year was about 16,000. In 2 months, the United States built what Japan built in 12. That is not a statistic in a book. That is a sound to a pilot. It is the sky filling, refilling, and refilling again. Shipbuilding told the same story in steel. The Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It was a demonstration for cameras, but it was not a trick. Normal builds averaged 42 to 50 days. By 1943, American shipyards were completing 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. In the first 4 months of 1943, those yards launched more merchant tonnage than Japan built in 7 years of preparation. Imagine trying to empty a reservoir while the river feeding it is flooding faster than you can bail. How do you compete with a tide? This scale reached into decisions, into the nerves of men. Japanese pilots began to receive letters from home that mentioned ration lines, blackouts, and rumors. They also wrote letters from the front with a note they had not used before: bewilderment. Where are all these aircraft coming from? One wrote. We shoot them down and the sky fills with replacements. This is industrial annihilation. It was not poetry. It was a description of a pressure you cannot see but cannot avoid. It is one thing to fight an opponent. It is another to fight a system. There was also a moment of personal collapse that signaled a larger truth. On April 18, 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto flew into a planned inspection in the Solomons. American codebreakers had read JN-25B and learned his itinerary. P-38 fighters intercepted and shot down his transport over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who both warned and planned, died because the enemy had read the mail of empire. His loss was emotional and strategic. It said two things at once. The United States could reach into the map at will, and Japan had lost the one leader who had both seen American power up close and tried to move within its limits. When a pilot heard the news, he did not only lose an admiral, he lost the voice in the room that said, "This is how big they are." By late 1943, even the rhythm of combat changed. Japan had started the war with a corps of elite aviators trained over years. Those men were dead, missing or grounded by exhaustion. Replacements went to the front with months of preparation. Some had never fired at a moving target before combat. It is not a failing of spirit. It is the math of training pipelines and fuel budgets. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived in squadrons with more hours and better radios, backed by logistics that could swap out an engine like a tire. At sea, the silent war was the deadliest of all. American submarines multiplied. They were not as famous as carriers, but they were relentless. They hunted tankers first. In 1941, Japan had planned to solve fuel with conquest in the Dutch East Indies. By 1944, oil did not reach home. Tankers lay on the ocean floor by the hundreds. Each sinking was an invisible cut across the throat of an empire. A pilot on a runway could not see a submarine's torpedo. He only saw that there was no fuel truck. The home front framed these facts with its own measures. America's gross national income was almost 17 times Japan's. Its steel output was 5 times larger. Its population was more than double. These are cold words, but they formed the warm flow of food, the steady pulse of electricity, and the endless line of freight cars that fed factories that ran at night. Japan tried to stretch every resource, recycle every scrap, and train every willing man. The United States assigned tasks and met them with spares. Then came 1944, and the sky itself changed color. The United States produced 96,000 aircraft in that single year. At Willow Run in Michigan, the Ford plant delivered a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes, day and night. Each bomber required about 1,550,000 parts. You can picture that on a factory floor. You can also hear it from the runway. It is the hum that never stops. It is the sound of a nation deciding that time is its weapon. In June, the Pacific heard what production looks like when it flies. Task Force 58 assembled 15 carriers and 900 aircraft for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese air groups that met them were brave but thin, full of replacement pilots who had not flown in heavy combat. The result was a slaughter Americans nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Between 350 and 600 Japanese aircraft were lost in air and on decks, along with 2 more carriers. The sea in June 1944 was a mirror that showed the truth. Skill without replacements drowns. On the Japanese side, something new entered the mind. It was not fear of the enemy's pilot, it was fear of the enemy's process. You could plan to outfly a man. You could not plan to outfly a factory. You could avoid a patrol. You could not avoid a shift change. Every time a Japanese pilot survived, he returned to fewer friends and a thinner fuel allotment. Every time an American pilot survived, he returned to a deck with more planes than yesterday. The surprise of this period is not only the size of American output, it is the speed with which mistakes became fatal. When Japan lost carriers at Midway, it could not replace them at rate. When America lost ships at both ends of the ocean, the yards absorbed the shock and continued at full throttle. By 1943, there was a strange headline in shipyard offices that was not written in any paper. 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. Not 1 in a week. 3 in 2 days. In the first 4 months of 1943 alone, more. merchant tonnage slid into the water than Japan had built in 7 years. That is not a statistic we remember with emotion, but it is the reason the war moved in one direction. Under this weight, Japanese doctrine shifted. The kamikaze did not come from madness. It came from arithmetic. If you cannot train a pilot for years, you can send him once. If you cannot build a replacement for a carrier, you can try to destroy your enemies with a human-guided bomb. These missions were not only a tactic, they were a confession that the conventional path was closed. When a nation asks its youth to die on purpose, it has already been beaten by factors that do not appear in a flight manual. At the same time, American submarines squeezed the empire's arteries. Oil could not move. Rubber and ore became statistics, not supplies. Factories in Japan stood with men ready at machines and nothing to feed them. War plants that had glowed at night dimmed and fell, silent. For a pilot, this meant one thing: sorties cut, training cut, hours cut, survival odds cut. For a ship captain, it meant staying in port under the shadow of air attack, because the sea no longer felt like a road. It felt like a trap. By late 1944 and into 1945, the city became another front. American B-29s crossed the Pacific high and fast. Strategic bombing burned Japanese cities, not with single explosions, but with fire that ate blocks at a time. People huddled in shelters and wrote in diaries about heat and smoke that sapped strength and made mornings grey with ash. The atomic bombs would follow, and they would end conversations in an instant. But the truth that many survivors felt was this: even before the new weapon, the old ones had already erased much of what made life normal. Inside squadrons, letters grew short and plain. "We are fine," a pilot might write. Then he would cross out "fine" and write "well." Then he would fold the paper and sit with the knowledge that his next mission felt thinner than the last. "We shoot them down, and the sky fills with replacements," one wrote. This is industrial annihilation. The phrase is heavy because it comes from a man who did not speak in slogans. It is the tight voice of someone who has knocked the same wall many times and felt it flex and return. What made this period more than numbers was the way numbers changed emotion. Pride in craft turned into pride in endurance. Then endurance turned into fatigue. Then fatigue turned into fatalism. The loser's perspective is not a line on a map. It is the ache in the ribs of a man who has been holding his breath for too long while the tide keeps rising. It is the realization that the battle is not at the tip of his wing but in a place he cannot reach. A railroad junction in Kansas, a press in Pittsburgh, a yard in San Francisco. The strategic picture by early 1945 was simple and crushing. America had built 297,000 aircraft during the war, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. Japan's entire war production across all categories came in at less than 10% of American output, often less than 5%. The United States had the gross national income, the steel, and the population to run at this speed without tearing itself apart. Japan did not. It tried, it improvised, it substituted, it sacrificed, but you cannot argue with a ratio forever. And yet, even in this, there are human details that surprise. Some Japanese pilots described American carriers at night as cities that floated. Light along the decks, music on the wind, fresh bread. A detail like that carries the whole war inside it. It is not only wealth, it is the choice to make comfort a tool so that fatigue never becomes the enemy. It is the gap between a nation that can afford margins and a nation that must grind edges. Another unexpected truth was how quickly American logistics could move wounded ships from broken to fighting. Nevada, California, West Virginia, Tennessee, ships left for dead at Pearl Harbor returned to sea after months in dry dock and repair. The base that had been attacked became the repair shop that fed the fleet that came back. This felt unfair to Japanese sailors, not because it violated any rule, but because it violated their sense of balance. You strike. The enemy shakes. He does not stagger. He tightens his bootlaces. The Battle of the Philippine Sea left an echo that did not fade. After that day, Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of itself. Pilots became too precious to risk in head-on confrontations. Missions shifted toward one-way attempts. The US Navy, with Task Force 58 swapped in and out like parts in a machine, kept adding carriers to the line. A pilot on one of those decks could count metal and measure morale. The loser on the other side could only count chances, and there were fewer each week. By mid-1945, oil no longer reached the bases that needed it. Training fields were quiet. Students sat in classrooms and listened to lectures about maneuver and fire discipline and never got the hours to practice. The Empire's Navy, which had once crossed oceans with confidence, was now fanned out as harbor defense. Every time a siren wailed, men looked up and knew the sky that came next would bring more, not less. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki would shock the world and end the argument in a flash. But from the loser's perspective, the argument had been bleeding out for a long time. Cities had already burned, fuel had already run out, ships had already been sunk, planes had already become promises that could not be kept. The bombs were the period at the end of a sentence that industry had been writing since 1942. In quiet rooms, a few officers remembered that first morning and understood the theme that ran from then to now. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece. It had bought time. But the Empire had misread what time meant. Time was not only days and months, it was production cycles. It was the time it takes to tool a factory, train a worker, and schedule a convoy. America had more of that kind of time. Japan had less. When the clock struck, every victory that had depended on surprise turned into a weight that had to be carried across years. There is a final human truth that gives this period its sting. The men who fought on the losing side did not lose because they were less brave. They lost because their country could not mate bravery to abundance. They flew as well as men can fly. They sailed as well as men can sail. They turned and dove and bled and returned and tried again. But they were fighting a nation that had decided to build faster than it could be broken. What do you do when the math of your future no longer adds up? You write home and leave out the part about numbers. You tell your wife you are well. You tell your parents you are proud. You tell yourself that tomorrow you will find a way to make one plane matter as much as 10. And then you walk to the flight line and hear the quiet where engines should be, and you know that hope has become a kind of courage too. This is how parts 4 and 5 end, not with a single explosion, but with a curve that does not bend. The curve is output. The curve is fuel. The curve is bodies trained and fed and supplied. The loser's perspective understands curves because it has to live under them. The pilots who survived into 1945 could name their friends who did not. They could not name the thousands of rivets that held their opponents' ships together. That is the difference. That is why the question that began on a frozen deck in 1941 now has an answer that does not move. The enemy they struck woke up, stood up, and built. The rest of the story is surrender, and the way men learn to speak it without breaking. August 15th, 1945. A voice came through radios and loudspeakers and open windows. It was calm and distant, almost formal. Emperor Hirohito said the words that could not be avoided. Japan would accept the terms. The war was over. Many did not understand the first time. Some could not believe it the second time. Others understood at once, and their legs gave way. Under them. For those who had flown over Oahu at dawn, it felt like an echo from a very long tunnel. They had won a morning and lost a world. Lieutenant Zenji Abe lived to hear that voice. He had carried a farewell letter in his pocket on the way to Pearl Harbor. He carried a different letter now, written to himself in silence over years, a list of what victory could not overcome. He had flown with skill. He had survived with luck. He had watched young men die with both. He had also watched the sky change color, not with weather but with numbers. The realization came slowly, then all at once. The war he was in was not a duel of aces. It was a match between an island and a continent. We like to think that history turns on courage. It does. But in modern war, courage is only the beginning. The rest is production, transport, repair, petroleum, training, replacement, and 100 small systems that must not fail at once. Abe learned this as a feeling before he could say it as a sentence. He learned it watching planes return thin and tired, seeing oil rationed like medicine, hearing the engine room report that one more sortie was not possible today. He did not stop being brave. He began to see that bravery had a limit when it could not call for supplies, and hear a steady answer. The oil embargo that set this story in motion had a goal: stop expansion without firing a shot. It cut off 80% of Japan's oil. It did not force surrender. It forced a choice. The choice was a gamble: strike to create time, then negotiate from new ground. But time is a strange thing in war. It is not only dates on a calendar. It is the speed of a conveyor belt across a factory floor. It is the time to cut steel and to train a new crew. It is the time to launch a ship and to repair a damaged one. The United States had more of this kind of time. Japan had very little. The embargo did not only block fuel, it revealed the hierarchy of global power. America's gross national income was about 17 times Japan's. Its steel output was roughly 5 times larger. It had twice the population. These numbers were not statistics to men like Abe at first. They were rumors. They were insults told by pessimists. After 1942, they became facts that showed up in the sky and at sea. The United States built 297,000 aircraft during the war. It built 193,000 artillery pieces. It built 86,000 tanks and 2 million army trucks. Japan's output across categories was under 10% of that total. In many cases, it was under 5%. Numbers like these explain why a pilot could shoot down an enemy plane and watch its place filled by 2 more before he turned for home. Abe and the men who survived long enough to become old felt the weight of this understanding. They looked back at Pearl Harbor as a remarkable piece of planning and training. It hit hard. It hit fast. It hit first. It was also a move that guaranteed a larger defeat because it did not break what mattered most. The oil tank stood. The repair shop stood. The dry dock stood. Pearl Harbor remained a forward base. Ships raised from the mud returned to sea. Nevada, California, West Virginia, Tennessee sailed again. The place Japan tried to turn into a grave became a workshop that kept the Pacific Fleet in the fight until the end. This is the loser's perspective. And it is not bitterness. It is clarity sharpened by loss. It looks at the same facts that triumph loves, and it asks a different question. Not, how did we win? But what did we fail to break? It says that war, after a certain point, is not a test of will. It is a test of systems. It is the way a nation can keep a promise to a soldier at 2 a.m. on a cold runway. It is the way a ship can limp into port and leave whole in months. It is the way a new pilot can step onto a deck with enough hours to survive his first fight. Abe met Americans after the war. He met men he had tried to kill, and he found, as many find, that the face of the enemy is human when the helmet is off. Some offered him coffee. Some offered him questions. He answered the same one many times. Did you think you could win? He said what Yamamoto had said in Warning. Victory would have required dictating peace in Washington. That was impossible. He said what he had learned in the cockpit. You cannot outfly a factory. He did not say this to excuse himself. He said it to name the truth that cost so many lives. Yamamoto did not live to hear surrender. He died in April 1943 because American codebreakers read JN-25B and sent fighters to the right sky at the right minute. His death is a small model of the whole war. Information met planning, planning met production, production met action. Japan produced brilliant officers and pilots. The United States produced processes that kept working after midnight. A gambler can win a hand. He cannot change the odds once the deck is dealt, and he is sitting at a table built by the opponent. We must not turn this into a simple moral. It is not that strong nations deserve to win and weak ones deserve to lose. It is that leaders who mistake early success for long-term certainty place their people in a trap. They tell them that spirit will make up the difference. For a time, spirit does. Then the bill arrives. It arrived in the Marianas, where Task Force 58 brought 15 carriers and 900 aircraft to a fight Japan could not match. It arrived under the waves, where American submarines cut the lines to oil and left tankers on the ocean floor. It arrived over cities where B-29s and then atomic bombs ended nights and families in the same hour. What should we carry from this? Not a thrill, not a slogan, a responsibility. To learn how modern war picks its winners before the first shot. To ask whether policy is building a peace or building a corner we cannot escape. To recognize that embargoes and resources are not abstract. They press on people. They shape choices. They turn a man like Abe into a letter in a pocket, into a pilot at low altitude, into an old man who tells his story in a quiet room and tries to make a younger listener hear the sound of factories when he says the word fate. There is also a gentler lesson, and it belongs to anyone who has ever been told they must win because they want it more. Desire matters. It does not melt steel. Courage matters. It does not refine oil. In our own lives, we meet smaller versions of this truth. We work hard, and still the system around us decides more than our effort can move. That is not a reason to give up. It is a reason to understand the system and to change it if we can, or to choose a fight that fits what we can really sustain. Nations are not so different from people in this. When Emperor Hirohito spoke, he asked his people to endure the unendurable. The words were formal, but the feeling was personal. Mothers and fathers had buried sons. Wives had hung on to hope and learned to live with ash. Pilots had watched friends vanish into the sea. Sailors had sat in harbors while the sky changed color and grown old in a few months. No sentence from a palace could mend this. The only repair possible was memory told without lies. The losers. Perspective is not a story of shame. It is a story of limits. It is the promise to say what happened as it felt and as it was. So let us be honest in our reflection. Pearl Harbor was a success that carried defeat inside it. The embargo was a pressure meant to prevent invasion that instead set a clock. American industry was not only large, it was organized. Japanese skill was not only brave, it was finite. By the end, kamikaze missions were not simply fanatic acts. They were the math of a system that could not keep up, expressed in the most tragic way a nation can ask of its children. The atomic bombs made surrender unavoidable, but by then, production and blockade had already closed the circle. If you have stayed with this story, you know now why Abe's question on a frozen deck still matters. Are they weak or do we not understand them? It is a question for every time and place where leaders speak of quick wars and easy wins. It is a question for citizens too, who must test the words they are given against facts that can be counted. It is a question for us here listening, who can decide whether memory becomes wisdom or only becomes noise. I ask you to carry this forward. Think about the men who fought and lost, not as symbols but as people who learned truths the hard way. Think about the power of systems and the cost when they are misjudged. Think about how we can make choices that do not turn bravery into waste. If this perspective has moved you, if it has helped you see World War II with new eyes, please subscribe to the channel by clicking the red button so you do not miss what comes next. Like the video to help this story reach more people, and share your questions or your personal experiences in the comments anonymously if you wish. Your voice matters here. Your reflection keeps memory honest. Your curiosity keeps history alive.